Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Sounds Like a Drum. I'm Ben, and on this week's episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that came up as a request from last week's episode on the electro snare sound thing, getting into the Evans Hybrid Snare Batter head. So last week we had a lot of great feedback on the episode focusing on using the Evans MX5 snare side head as a batter head for kind of an electronic sampled snare drum sound. Several people asked about using the Evans Hybrid Coated Snare Batter head, which was originally designed for marching snare drums, but using that on a drum set snare drum. And particularly one individual happened to ask about using it on a DW Edge snare, which coincidentally enough is the exact snare that I use my Hybrid Coated Snare Batter on. So this week we've got the Evans Hybrid on a DW Edge snare. It's 13 inches in diameter and 6 inches deep. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Edge snares, they have a top and bottom section. The bearing edges, respectively, are metal. They're, I believe, steel? It's got to be steel. This thing's so heavy. I use it as a door stopper sometimes. And the middle section is wood. In this case, it's maple. And just like the MX5 from last week, I prefer really to only use these fiber-based drum heads on metal bearing edges, and that's just out of fear for using them on anything that material could dig into. Using it on wooden bearing edges, kind of not my favorite thing. And I definitely wouldn't want to destroy the bearing edges on any of my drums, nor would I want you to do that to any of your drums. I know that we've had some people who have mentioned that no, they don't necessarily have a Superphonic or some other metal-based shell drum, but unfortunately those are the drums where I recommend using these particular heads. We'll talk more about the things that you can do if you've got wooden drums and you're going for similar sounds in the future. So one of the reasons why I wanted to dig into this drum head in particular, in addition to the fact that we had some people requesting a feature on it specifically, was because it's a really unique drum head. And I'll talk about some of the backstory after I do a little demo, but first I want to play this for you just right out of the gate with next to no tension on the batter head. I've got this thing pretty much pillowed out. I mean, you can push into it really easily and the thing moves. And then I've got the snare side tuned up probably in a medium range or so. Yes, I know that's not super specific, but again, to get there, you're gonna have to experiment on your own anyway. And then I've got the snare wires dialed in so that they aren't choking out the bottom side, but that they're not too raspy. They're not ringing on for a long time. So let's hear what that sounds like. Just gonna do some single hits on it, and then in a little bit, I'll play it in some context. You can hear it with the full kit. So you can hear that's pretty punchy. Again, no EQ or compression on that. It's just the AKG C414 over to my left here. And it's just got a bunch of gut punch to it. It's kind of crazy. This isn't really tuned, so to speak. I've just dialed things in terms of really the snare tension and then the snare side to be able to get that snare sound that I'm looking for. I want it deep and fat. And one of the reasons why you can get away with this sound, particularly I like using this in more of a recording environment, and maybe in the future we'll demonstrate this with some close mics and we'll add some compression, have some fun along those lines. But one of the reasons why I like using this head for a deeper sound rather than a higher pitched sound is because it's thicker. Last week we talked about the mass of the MX5 head and the fact that it's a thinner, lighter weight drum head and does a really good job of cranking up into the stratosphere. Now, one of the reasons I like this head so much, the hybrid, is because with all that added mass, it does low frequencies really well. That lower frequency response is directly attributed to the heavier mass. You've got more mass in this head, and because there's more mass, it moves slower or at a lower frequency. That frequency of motion directly translates to the frequency at which you're hearing its resonance. So the sound of this drumhead is inherently going to be deeper and lower than that of a drumhead that is thinner and has less mass, like the MX5. Now, while this isn't necessarily a Kevlar brand material, it still is made up of aramid fibers, and because of the heft of this drum head, you can leave it tuned pretty low and it'll still hold up really well. Now, if you're beating the heck out of it with large drumsticks, I mean like tree trunks, yeah, eventually it's gonna give up. It's gonna break out. You're gonna find that the coating layer on the top there will start to split and it'll just come apart on you. But if you're experimenting with this kind of thing, and particularly I like using this as more of an effect snare, especially in recording environments where it's not seeing a ton of stress, it's not being played like you're trying to reach the back of, an auditorium or an arena or something like that. One of the most important parts, though, of getting this sound is dialing in the snare side. And I really do encourage you to watch the previous videos that we've done explaining our approach for tuning snare side and snare wires themselves. Same as we've seen in the past, use the ruler method in order to get an appropriate balance of height on that bottom hoop all the way around the bottom of the drum. Now, as Cody's talked about in the past, referring to the snare side as the reso head, and it really is the resonant head, it has a lot to do with the overall tone of this drum, especially when tuned super low. So when you're going for that deeper, fatter sound, and we've got an episode dedicated entirely to that, regardless of the drum head you're using, you're gonna wanna make sure that you don't have your snare side cranked up too high. At the same time, I do have it a little bit higher than I would if this were in a medium tuning range, just because I want it to throw some of that sound back and I want it to react quickly to the impact on the batter head. So as I mentioned, I've got this head pretty much not tuned at all. It's just way down in the basement, it's pillowed out, and the idea here is you're just going for impact, and then more of the tone is coming from the snare side and getting that balance of tension right with the snare wires themselves. As we talked about in the video that describes how we tune for a fat snare drum sound, it's really important to make sure that you do have an elongated note. Big sounds sound bigger when they have a longer envelope to them. You want some of that snare resonance. You want some of that additional sound. It shouldn't be super staccato and articulate. If you try to do that, even try to do that digitally, and you shorten up a waveform or something like that, or you clip it, you'll notice when you just get the transient, that beginning, that initial impact is much more articulate and tends to be higher pitch. In fact, when I hit this head, I've noticed that the pitch jumps up for a moment because I'm actually compressing the tension. I'm putting more tension into the drum head. It has so little tension on it to begin with. And then it drops down. So it's important to capture the entire elongated note there. Just so you can hear this in the context of the kit, I'm going to demo it a little bit with the hi-hats in there, the bass drum, and I'll go back and forth a little bit just between the MX5 that's still on the Superphonic and then to the hybrid that's here on the DW Edge snare, so you can get that comparison of really high sound and really low fat sound. Now, the cool thing about the hybrid head is that you really can do a lot with it. And in the future, I think maybe I'll make a demo video that goes through a range of tunings on this thing because it does sound good tuned up high. Now, I take my inspiration for tuning this head lower rather than cranking it up high from Jojo Mayer and seeing what he's done, often by putting the hoop crasher on it, the Sabian hoop crasher that he created, and getting a little bit of that white noise sound that adds on to what the snare wires are already producing, but then helps to muffle the head a little bit, and then he just tunes that thing super low. I find that this is a more interesting characteristic for the kind of sounds that I like to get out of this head than cranking it up super high. This is just a personal preference thing in terms of recognizing what the quality of sound is in different tonal ranges. Of course, another element to all of this that we don't discuss very frequently, but is equally, if not more important than anything else, is what is the room around you doing for sound? Is the room going to resonate at a certain frequency? How is it contributing to the sound of the drum? And again, this is where it makes the most sense for you to experiment based on the space that you're playing in. And it's going to change. You're not just going to be able to reference specific settings wherever you go in any room that you play. That could be a good starting point, but that's why we recommend these methods and approaches rather than finite statements of here's our tuning number or the specific pitch that we're tuning to. You're going to have to experiment with that based on your drum, your playing, your setup, and in your room or in whatever room you may be in. Now, I know I mentioned that I would get into a little bit of the history of this drum head for those of you who are interested. The way that this head came about was a little bit of a happy accident, at least how it relates to the drum set world rather than the marching world. Originally, this drum head was developed specifically for marching snare drums. That's why it's only available in 13-inch and 14-inch sizes. You won't ever find them doing a 12 unless they happen to start making 12-inch marching snares, and those get popular. When they were going through the testing phases and prototyping the variations on this drum head for use in marching, they had a lot of great success with this particular version. Unfortunately, they found that once they tried it out under sunlight, it didn't react so well. And I mean when it's out under sun for hours and hours and hours on end, constant playing, seeing a lot of heavy use. It was discovered that the UV rays from the sun were starting to deteriorate the material and affect the durability of it over time. Now, this is something that was combated relatively easily by adding a UV layer on top. Now, this is different from the Evans UV1 coating, which is just a UV cured coating. This is actually a UV inhibitor, quite similar, believe it or not, to the way that you would have sunscreen or suntan lotion to prevent yourself from getting sunburn. This UV inhibitor was applied to the drum head in order to prevent it from getting sunburn and prevent it from falling apart when it was under such high tension and high use under the sun for long periods of time. Of course, they were left with quite a few drum heads that were ready to go to market that they didn't know what to do with, and it was still a cool drum head. It just couldn't sit out under the sun for 8 to 12 hours in a full day and just see that kind of heavy use. So they turned it into a drum set head, and we're lucky enough to have this version that has a light coating layer on the top that works really well for drum set snare drums. Now, this isn't a sponsored video or anything like that, but I did want to share this with you because I think it's a particularly cool drum head. We had some people ask about it, and I wanted to demonstrate how I like to use it. Keep an eye out for a video in the future, maybe some posts on our Instagram channel. You should make sure that you're following us at Sounds Like a Drum. And we will demonstrate this maybe in a couple different use case scenarios and different tunings in the future. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode, please do give us a thumbs up down below, leave us a comment and let us know what you thought, and if you experimented with this head in the past, how you like to tune it. We're always interested in seeing what you do with various gear. And make sure that you're subscribed and click on that bell icon so that you get a notification anytime we release a new video or update here on the YouTube channel.